Imagine standing in a hall built from black dragonbone rafters, torches throwing orange light across a throne made of fused iron swords and cooling glass, while the most powerful man in the known world coughs blood into a golden cloth, and every single person in that room is quietly calculating how his death will change their life. That is not fiction born from nowhere. That is the exact atmosphere historians and storytellers alike describe when they study the final year of a dying medieval monarch surrounded by rival heirs. And in the world of Valdreth, in the year 214 of the Age of Embers, that dying king was Aldric Emberdrake, and what happened after his last breath would tear his kingdom in half. Before we go further, if you find stories about power, betrayal, and the brutal cost of a crown fascinating, subscribe now, because this channel breaks down fictional epics with the same rigor documentary historians use on real royal collapses. And I want you to comment below. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city. I read every single one. Here is the picture you need first. Valdreth was not one kingdom by accident. It was 7 warring territories, bound together 100 years earlier by Aldric's ancestor, the first king to tame the great fire drakes and ride them into battle. That founding king did something almost no ruler in this fictional world had done. He unified through fear, not love. His dragons burned 2 rival strongholds to ash before the other 5 territories agreed to bend the knee. And ever since, the throne of Valdreth, the Cinder Throne, forged from 1,000 melted blades taken from defeated enemies, was held together by one single fragile idea, that whoever sat on it commanded dragons no army could stop. Aldric inherited that throne as a young man, full of energy, beloved by the smallholders because he lowered grain taxes in his first year. But by the time we meet him at the center of this story, he is 52 years old, his body failing from a wasting sickness the healers of the Sunspire Citadel could not name. His legs were swollen, his skin had begun to blacken at the joints. Some records, kept by the fictional royal Meister Ordwin Talvain in his chronicle, The Long Decline, described the king needing to be carried to court in a chair by 4 men because he could no longer walk unaided. And here's the part that should make your stomach turn a little. Everyone around him knew he was dying, and almost nobody was thinking about him. They were thinking about what came next. 20 years before his death, Aldric had done something unprecedented in Valdreth's history. He had no living sons from his first marriage, only a daughter, Seraphine. And instead of waiting for a nephew or cousin to inherit through the male line, as every king before him had done, Aldric called his entire court together and named Seraphine his heir. He made every great lord and lady kneel and swear an oath to her, right there, in front of witnesses. It was meant to settle the matter permanently. It did not. Because 6 years after that oath, Aldric remarried a younger noblewoman named Isolde Farrow, and she gave him a son, a boy named Rodrik. And suddenly the kingdom that had sworn loyalty to a daughter now had a legitimate male heir standing in the shadows of the throne room, growing older every single year, watched by ambitious lords who never liked the idea of a queen in the first place. Ask yourself something. If you had sworn an oath to one heir, but a better, more traditional option was suddenly born into the family, would you keep your word? Because that is exactly the test the lords of Valdreth were about to face, and most of them would fail it. By the final months of Aldric's life, the court had split into 2 camps without anyone officially declaring it. One faction, gathered around Seraphine, included the fictional Sea Lords of House Talomere, who controlled Valdreth's largest fleet. The other, gathered around young Rodrik and his ambitious mother Isolde, included the Iron Wardens of House Greycrest, who controlled the largest standing army in the Western Territories. Aldric, weak and fading, tried to keep both sides calm through sheer force of personality. Records describe him holding small private audiences, reassuring Seraphine's allies one week and Rodrik's allies the next, refusing to publicly resolve the tension because he could not bear to choose between the daughter he had sworn the kingdom to and the son he had watched grow up in front of him. That refusal, that avoidance, is, according to the in-world chronicles, the single decision that made everything that followed almost unavoidable. A dying king who will not clearly say who inherits doesn't prevent a war, he guarantees one. Now picture the final week of his life. Aldric summons his council for what will be his last address. Witnesses recorded, in the fictional account, testimonies of the Sunspire court, that he tried to speak Seraphine's name, tried to formally reaffirm her as heir one final time before his strength failed. But those closest to his sickbed disagreed sharply, even decades later, on what his last coherent words actually were. Some claimed he named Seraphine, Others, loyal to Rodrik's faction, insisted he changed his mind at the very end. That single unresolved sentence, "What did the king actually say in his final hour?" became the spark that lit the fire. Because within 3 days of Aldric's death, 2 coronations happened in 2 different cities. Seraphine was crowned in the Sunspire Citadel by her allies. Rodrik was crowned 400 miles away in the fortress of Greycrest by his mother's faction. 2 monarchs, 2 crowns, 1 throne. Stay with me, because in the next chapter, we go inside the moment the kingdom fractures completely, and you'll meet the dragons that were about to turn a political dispute into the bloodiest civil war Valdreth ever recorded. 2 crowns, 1 throne. Here's a question worth sitting with. How do you fight a war against your own family when both sides believe completely and sincerely that they are the rightful ruler? Not lying, not scheming for power out of pure greed, actually believing it. That is the trap Valdreth fell into the moment word spread that both Seraphine Emberdrake and her half-brother Rodrik had been crowned in the same week. Let's talk about who was actually in these 2 camps, because this is where the story stops being abstract politics and starts being deeply, painfully human. Seraphine was 34 years old when her father died, old enough to have spent 2 decades preparing to rule, surrounded by advisors who had watched her grow from a girl practicing sword forms into a woman who had, according to the fictional chronicle, the Emberdrake line, bonded with her own dragon at age 11, a fierce gray-scaled beast named Thornwing. She had been publicly named heir. She had the oath of the court. In almost any legal sense within Valdreth's traditions, she had the stronger claim. But claims on parchment don't win wars. Armies do. And Rodrik, only 19 years old at his coronation, had something Seraphine's faction feared more than any legal argument: the backing of House Greycrest's Iron Legions, and a mother in Isolde Pharaoh who was, by every surviving account, one of the sharpest political minds in the kingdom's history. Isolde understood something brutal and simple: that half the lords of Valdreth had never truly accepted a woman ruling from the Cinder Throne, no oath or not, and she built her son's claim entirely around that quiet resentment. If you're just joining this story, subscribe now so you don't miss what happens when this civil war finally reaches the sky, because this conflict didn't stay on the ground for long. Both sides needed something beyond soldiers and ships to win. They needed dragons. And this is the detail that makes Valdreth's civil war different from almost any other succession crisis you'll ever study, fictional or historical. There were roughly 17 adult dragons alive in the kingdom at the time, each one bonded permanently to a single rider, and every single dragon was about to become a weapon in a war between siblings. The Council of Dragon Keepers at the Sunspire Citadel, an in-world institution called the Wormwatch, tried desperately to stay neutral in the opening weeks. Their official position, recorded in the Wormwatch ledgers, was that dragons should never be turned against each other by rival family members, because the last time that happened, 2 centuries earlier, an entire mountain range was left permanently scorched and uninhabitable. But neutrality collapses fast when your own home is under threat. One by one, riders chose sides, some out of loyalty to Seraphine's 20 years of preparation, others out of loyalty to the more traditional male-line succession Rodrik represented. Here's where it gets genuinely tragic. Dragon riders in Valdreth were often related to each other, cousins, half-siblings, childhood friends who had trained together in the same dragon pits as children. The fictional account of the rider Cassian Voss, who fought for Seraphine, describes him facing his own cousin, a rider loyal to Rodrik, in the skies above the Ashen Straits, and hesitating for 3 full seconds before either one attacked. Those 3 seconds, according to the Chronicle, cost Cassian his life. That's the emotional core of this entire war, and it's worth pausing on. This was never dragons versus dragons in some abstract sense. It was family against family, riding the same fire-breathing creatures that had once made their bloodline unstoppable, now using those same creatures to burn each other out of the sky. By the 2nd month of the war, both Seraphine and Rodrik understood something terrifying. Dragons were not just weapons, they were the only thing keeping the 7 territories of Valdreth from spiraling into total anarchy, and every dragon killed in this civil war, sibling against sibling, was a dragon that could never fight for the kingdom again. Some in-world chroniclers estimated that Valdreth's dragon population, once numbering close to 20, would never fully recover after this war, no matter who won. I want you to comment below. If you were a dragon rider in Valdreth, torn between the sister who held the legal oath and the brother backed by the largest army, which side do you think you'd choose? And could you actually go through with fighting your own cousins over it? The turning point of the war's early phase came at the Battle of Thornfield Pass, where Seraphine's naval allies from House Talomere attempted to cut off Rodrik's supply lines from the Western Territories. It should have been a straightforward victory. Talomere's fleet outnumbered anything Rodrik's landlocked allies could put on the water. But Rodrik's faction had a secret weapon nobody expected. A rider named Brennus Ashcombe, a minor lord's son who had bonded with the largest dragon in the kingdom, a beast called Cinderjaw, and who used it not against ships, but against the coastal fortresses protecting Talomere's harbor. In one night, according to The Long Decline, Brennus burned 3 fortified towers to rubble, forcing Talomere's fleet to retreat before the battle even properly began. That single night changed the entire momentum of the war. Seraphine's faction, who had entered the conflict believing their legal claim and naval strength made victory almost guaranteed, suddenly understood they were facing something far more dangerous than they'd planned for. In the next chapter, we go straight into the war's bloodiest turn. The moment 2 dragons collide in the sky above the capital itself, and the moment that decided, once and for all, who would actually sit on the Cinder Throne. Fire over the capital. There is one battle in this entire war that every single chronicle, from every single faction, described the same way. Not because everyone agreed on who was right, but because what happened was simply too catastrophic to argue about. This is the Battle of the Sunspire Skies, the moment the war stopped being fought at fortresses and harbors and finally came home to the capital city itself. By this point in the conflict, roughly 8 months after the 2 coronations, both Seraphine and Rodrik had lost allies, lost dragons, and lost patience. The 7 territories were starving. Trade routes had collapsed. Smallholders who had nothing to do with the royal family's dispute were burying children who died from famine brought on by broken supply chains. This is a detail worth sitting with. Succession wars in Valdreth were never really fought only by kings and dragons. They were paid for by ordinary people who never got a vote in who sat on the throne. If this story is hitting you the way it's hitting me, let me know in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment, because what happens next is the single most devastating sequence in this entire saga. Seraphine, increasingly desperate to end the war before her kingdom starved completely, made a decision her closest advisors reportedly begged her not to make. She would fly Thornwing directly to the Sunspire Citadel, the capital her brother's forces had captured months earlier, and confront Rodrik's faction directly, hoping that a decisive strike at the heart of enemy territory would break their will to keep fighting. What she didn't fully account for was Brennus Ashcombe and Cinderjaw, still the single most feared dragon and rider pair in the entire war. The confrontation above the capital lasted, according to multiple chronicled accounts, less than 4 minutes. 4 minutes that ended 2 decades of careful preparation, 1 legal oath, and 1 young woman's entire claim to the throne she was born to inherit. Thornwing, wounded early in the exchange, was brought down over the harbor district, and Seraphine did not survive the fall. I'm not going to pretend that's an easy thing to narrate, and if you've been with this story since chapter 1, you understand why. We spent this entire documentary showing you a woman who spent 20 years doing everything right by the rules of her world. Sworn in by oath, trained since childhood, only to lose everything in 4 minutes because a dying king couldn't say 1 clear sentence at the end of his life. Here's the question I want you to sit with, and comment your honest answer. Was Seraphine's death a tragedy caused by her brother's ambition, or a tragedy caused by her father's refusal to settle the succession clearly while he still could? Because the chronicles genuinely disagree on where to place the blame, and I think that disagreement is the entire point of this story. With Seraphine gone, her faction did not simply surrender. Her closest general, an aging commander named Talon Reyes, refused to accept defeat and continued the war for another 4 months in her name, arguing that her infant son, yes, Seraphine had a young child, barely 2 years old, who technically now held her claim, should inherit once he came of age, with Reyes ruling as regent in the meantime. This is the part of the story almost nobody expects. The war didn't end when the main character died. It kept going, messier and bloodier, fought now in her memory rather than her presence, by people who weren't entirely sure anymore what they were fighting for beyond momentum and grief. The final major engagement of the war, the Siege of Ashcombe Hold, saw Rodrik's forces, now clearly winning, surround Talon Reyes and the remnants of Seraphine's faction in a fortress in the Eastern Territories. Reyes held out for 6 weeks, hoping for reinforcements from allies who never came, before finally negotiating a surrender that spared the lives of the soldiers still loyal to him, in exchange for formally recognizing Rodrik as king and renouncing any future claim from Seraphine's infant son. The war that had split Valdreth in half, killed 7 of the 17 dragons that existed at its start, and cost thousands of lives among smallholders who never chose a side, was over. Rodrik Emberdrake, 19 years old when it began, was 20 years old when it ended. Sitting alone on the Cinder Throne his father once refused to clearly promise him. In our final chapter, we look at what Rodrik's victory actually cost him, what happened to Seraphine's surviving child, and the uncomfortable lesson this entire saga leaves behind about what a crown is actually worth. The cost of the crown. Here's the thing almost nobody tells you about wars fought over succession, whether in the real history books or in fictional sagas built to reflect them. The person who wins the throne rarely wins anything resembling a happy ending. And King Rodrik Emberdrake, sitting on the Cinder Throne at 20 years old, is one of the clearest examples of that uncomfortable truth you will ever encounter. Before we get into how this story actually ends, I want to ask you directly, after everything we've covered, the oath broken by circumstance, the 4-minute battle that ended a 20-year claim, the 6-week siege that finished the war, do you think Rodrik's victory was worth what it cost the kingdom? Comment your honest take, because the chronicles themselves seem to have decided the answer was no. Rodrik inherited a kingdom in ruins. 10 of the original 17 dragons Valdreth possessed before the war had survived it, and several of those were too wounded or too old to breed, meaning the kingdom's single greatest military advantage, the thing that had unified Valdreth a century earlier, was permanently, irreversibly weakened. The fictional chronicler Ordwin Talvain, writing years later in The Long Decline, argued that Valdreth never recovered its former dominance after this war, and that neighboring territories who had once feared the kingdom's dragons began openly testing its borders within a decade. The human cost was worse. Entire noble houses that had picked the losing side were stripped of land and title. House Talomir, once commanding the largest fleet in the kingdom, was reduced to a minor coastal holding, their ships seized and redistributed to Rodrik's allies in House Greycrest. Families that had been neutral found themselves punished anyway, simply for having relatives who fought for Seraphine. And Seraphine's son, the 2-year-old boy who briefly represented a continued claim to the throne, was, according to the surviving in-world records, sent away from court entirely, raised quietly in a minor holding far from the capital under a different family name, his mother's rebellion erased from his official lineage. Some later chronicles suggest Rodrik did this not entirely out of cruelty, but out of a genuine, complicated desire to give the boy a chance at a normal life, away from a court that would never let him forget whose son he was. Whether that was mercy or another form of quiet erasure is something historians of Valdreth still argue about. If you've made it this far in the story, I have to ask, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments which chapter hit you hardest, because I read every single response, and it genuinely shapes what saga we cover next. Isolde Farrow, the woman whose sharp political mind had engineered her son's entire claim to the throne, lived to see him crowned but reportedly spent her final years isolated from court politics, watching a kingdom she had helped fracture struggle to rebuild. Some accounts describe her expressing private regret near the end of her life, not for supporting her son, but for how completely the war had hollowed out the kingdom he inherited. And Rodrik himself, according to the chronicles, ruled for another 18 years, remembered not as a great conqueror or a beloved reformer, but as a king who spent nearly 2 decades quietly trying to repair what 1 year of civil war had destroyed. He never fully succeeded. The dragon population never returned to its former numbers. The noble houses never fully trusted each other again. And the Cinder Throne, the seat forged from 1,000 melted blades a century earlier to symbolize unity through strength, became instead a permanent reminder of exactly how fragile that unity had always been. So here is the real question this entire saga leaves behind, and I want you to genuinely think about it before you scroll away. Aldric Emberdrake had 20 years to clearly settle who would inherit his throne. 20 years. And in his final, weakened hour, one unclear sentence undid 2 decades of careful preparation, killed his daughter, orphaned his grandson, and cost his kingdom a war it never fully recovered from. Power, in the world of Valdreth, was never really about dragons or armies or ancient oaths. It was about the willingness of one dying man to say one clear sentence while he still had the strength to say it, and the devastating cost of everyone else when he didn't. If this saga moved you, subscribe for the next one, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what you thought of the ending, and I'll see you in the next story.